Story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love, still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright.
Anybody have any questions or comments about the stuff that we've already studied up to this point before we move into new stuff? All right, I'll ask another question. Anybody have any questions or comments about the stuff you read in preparation for our discussion this morning? I'm asking this question, I'm trying something new. I'm asking this question trying to get questions at the beginning that are things that maybe you struggled with, or you had questions about, or you thought about, that I read over and ignored before I start my discussion, so I can order my discussion and flow, and it may influence what I cover. I don't want to skip stuff that needs to be covered. So anybody in their reading in preparation for this morning have anything that just stuck out with you? Yes, ma'am. I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's very normal. What do people do? Let's imagine ourselves in a situation where you've got a young father. He's in his 30s or 40s, and he gets a terminal diagnosis. He knows he is going to die. What does he tend to start doing? Especially if he's got young children. Starts teaching them the things that he thinks is important for them to know, that he knows he's not going to be around to help with later. Mothers do the same thing. It's very common when mothers are young and their children are very young and can't understand a lot of things in life, for them to actually sit down and write letters and leave them for their children that they can read later when they're older and understand these lessons that they want to be sure that their children get, but they know they're not going to be there for it. Jesus is about to go through this process where he's going to be crucified, and then he's going to be raised, and then what is he going to do? He's going to ascend back to heaven, and he's not going to be here anymore. He is getting his disciples ready to do the work that we have to do in walking in righteousness when he's not here to help. When he's not here to protect in a literal sense. He's with us always. He tells us that before he ascends, right? Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. But he's not literally there to come walking on the water and say, hey, come on out here, let me show you what your faith can do. Let me help you. When we start sinking, he's not literally there to take our hand the way that he did Peter's. He's only there in our knowledge and awareness of his promises to us. And so he wants us to be prepared. He wants us to be prepared for that day. We're not going to study it because we're not studying the Gospel of John this class period, but John 17 is that prayer that he prays to God, specifically mentioning the 11 that were chosen and given to him, and praying that God would be with them and keep them and strengthen them, and for those who would believe in him through their word. He expands at the end of the prayer. That is a prayer offered by Christ for the people that are going to remain in the world when he is no longer in the world, that they might be kept from the evil one. he understood the impact of his leaving the world. And Ms. Karen's correct. A lot of this is, hey, you need to know this stuff, and I'm not going to be around here much longer to be pointing it out to you on a daily basis. How many times had he said that spiritual things are more important than physical things? But listen to this. Verse 13, they sent him to some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians. Who were the Herodians, by the way? Okay, yeah, actually, I mean, they weren't Roman in descent, but Herod was the Roman ruler, and these were people who embraced Roman rule and who accepted it and who adapted into the culture. There were some Jews that hated the Romans, right? But there were others, it was just life. Okay. And so they supported Herod and supported what the Roman government was doing. He sent him to some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And so we're given a motive at the outset. These people don't like Jesus. Now, for very different reasons. The Pharisees didn't like Jesus for very different reasons than the Herodians didn't like Jesus, but neither of them liked him. And they were going to try to get him to say something that they could act on. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you're true and do not care about anyone's opinion." What is that all about? It sounds kind of flattering, doesn't it? I would take it as flattering if someone, hey, I know you don't care about. What do they mean? You don't care about anyone's opinion. He says what he thinks. He's not concerned with the politics of the time. He's not concerned with the orthodoxy of the time. The Pharisees were the orthodoxy of the time. Now, they had departed from the law of Moses, but they were the orthodoxy at the time. And he wasn't going to say something to make the Pharisees happy, or say something to make this group happy, or say something to make everyone happy, or not say something for any of those purposes. And it's generally viewed as being an honorable thing if you are truthful and plain spoken, right? We look at someone who's truthful and plain spoken and we say, hey, we like them. Until they're truthful and plain spoken to us. Now, when they're truthful and plain spoken to us, now all of a sudden we don't like them anymore, because what does that do? It points out where I'm wrong. And I don't want that. But boy, when they're doing it to someone else, we're sitting in the back yelling, amen, preach it. And so they're trying to flatter him and get him to be more bold in his response by leading him in saying, hey, we're actually coming to you because we know that you're true, and we know that you don't worry about it. We know that you're going to tell us the truth. They are trying to prevent him putting up any barriers and saying, no, I'm not going to answer that question. By the way, has he ever done that? Yeah, there were times that he did that. There were times that people came to them, they had questions, and he said, well, okay, I'll answer your question, but first you need to answer my question. And if you answer my question, then I'll answer your question. And they refused to answer his question. He said, then I'm not going to answer you. Well, they're wanting to make sure anything like that doesn't happen either. We know that you're truthful, and we know that you're not worried about what people think. So just be honest with us and tell us the truth. You're not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Somebody give me a citation from the Old Testament that answers questions about taxes. Which one of the general laws of the law of Moses, which are encapsulated in what? The Ten Commandments, right? Which one of those directly deals with taxes? And here's the point. Were the question of civil taxes a biblical question? We know that you're going to tell us the truth of God. We know that you don't worry about people's opinions. Tell us, Rome's trying to make us pay all these taxes. Is that right? Should we pay them? They didn't even ask him a real biblical question. It wasn't really a spiritual question at all. It, as we were told from the outset, was a question that was intended to entrap him, because the general attitude of people toward taxes is what? Raise your hand if you are thrilled that you get to pay taxes every year. For the record, the camera can't see you, so nobody raised their hand. Raise your hand if you're thrilled when they say we're going to raise your taxes and you're going to pay more. That was the attitude then too. Most of them hated paying taxes, and they really hated paying taxes to a government that they didn't even like. The Romans. You ever heard anybody reason along this way? Well, I don't agree with everything that the government's doing, so I'm not going to pay my taxes. You ever heard anybody reason along those lines? I have. I grew up in East Texas. I heard it all the time. Some of them actually did it and then got themselves in trouble. Because you want to make the government mad, don't give them the money that they want. The other way you want to make the government mad is what they're trying to get him to do. To encourage people. They wanted him to say what they expected any self-respecting Jew would say, which is what? Look, the Roman government's a bunch of heathen heretics, and you shouldn't give them any more of your money than you're absolutely forced to. That's what they're asking. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? Should we refuse the Roman tribute? Is it wrong for us to show tribute to Rome and to Caesar, who, by the way, walked around saying essentially what about himself? At this time, he wasn't yet God in his mind, but he was what? The next best thing to God. Should we not pay this tribute? Show our respect for this man who is encroaching upon God, knowing their hypocrisy. He said to them, why put me to the test? Now that question right there must have been kind of embarrassing for the questioners, who thought that they had set this up in such a way that he was going to be so puffed up that he would just readily offer an answer that they could then accuse him with. And his awareness of their test. And say, well, why do you test me like this? Bring me a denarius. Let me look at it. So they brought him one. He said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. He said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. What does that answer mean? And I'm going to tell you right now, his answer doesn't have anything specifically to do with taxes. It applies to such things. But it's much, much more powerful than that. There are things that function on this earth, and there are things that have to do with God. The temple's in the business of what? Things of God. Government's in the business of what? Things of man. The temple doesn't have any business trying to navigate the things of man. And the government doesn't have any business trying to control and exercise the things of God. It is this teaching right here and others like it throughout the Bible that gave the founders of our nation the concept of having a society from a governmental standpoint that did not embrace a particular religion. Whether they intended it to be carried out the way that it's carried out today is a whole nother debate. But guess where that debate is to be held? In the civic sphere Those are the debates that I had in political science classrooms when I was in college. Not debates for the church. It's not the church's role to tell people who to vote for, or even if they should vote, or to condemn anyone for who they vote for, or if they choose not to vote. Have my personal opinions about such things. I'll be happy to talk with you about those things on the telephone during the week, in the parking lot after services, anywhere else you want to meet. I not only have opinions, I have some strong opinions about some of those things. But when we walk in these doors and we assemble as a church, that's Caesar's business. That's not the Lord's business. You know what the Lord's business is? This word. The Lord's business is our souls. We don't teach government. We don't teach economics. We don't teach, throw anything else into that mix you want to. What does the church teach? The Word of God. Period. End of story. We are not a civic organization. We are not a voting organization. We are not and this is a big problem that arose in the early part of the 20th century in the United States. We are not here to transform society, which is what the social gospel really is. Just so you know, the social gospel is not dinner parties. The social gospel was the belief that you take the principles of the gospel and you apply them to society writ large. And what they ended up doing was churches started offering civic type social services, believing it was their duty to eradicate hunger, our sickness. Started building hospitals and clinics, dentist's office. Is it wrong to offer dental services to people? Is it wrong to feed people? No. Is it the work of God? Is it what he sent us to do? No, he sent us to do what? Preach the gospel. Render to God the things that are God's, and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. You can do both, but don't make the mistake of mixing them together. And that's what we have to understand from this. And he wants his disciples to know that. And you'll recall, in just a short order from this, not very many days away from this, he's standing before Pilate, and Pilate says, "Are you a king?" And he says, "You say rightly that I'm a king, but my kingdom is not of this realm. If my kingdom were of this realm, then my servants would be fighting. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world." The reason why he didn't have an army raised, fighting battles, trying to take over territory and actually take over the throne of Rome, is because that's not what he was doing. That's not the work of God. He was doing the work of his Father, which didn't have political boundaries. Our national boundaries, our ethnic boundaries. It was go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. And so when he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, he is saying we need to distinguish between the difference between spiritual things and physical things. And realize that when we are doing the work of God as the people of God in the kingdom of God, it's the things of God. And if we're doing other things, some of them are good and that's great, but it ain't the work of God. There's my Texas coming out, ain't. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's a long discussion, and I was actually thinking about that in my preparations. There's a lot of people that teach things like English to foreigners using the Bible, and what they're really doing is trying to indoctrinate them. And I'm not for that. Is it a noble thing to teach someone how to read? Sure. Can they in turn read the Word of God and learn and become obedient and get their soul saved? Yes. But did Jesus say, go out into all the world and teach everyone to read and then hand them a Bible so that they might be converted? No, what did he say? Go talk to them. Go teach them. If they never can read a word on a page, can they still understand the gospel and be saved? Yes, it's not the work to teach people how to read. It's the work to get people into a relationship with God through Christ for the salvation of their soul. And that's what we need to focus on. Yes, ma'am.
My brochures I make for spreading the word into Vietnamese, but I used Google and then I gave it to all the Vietnamese down in New Iberia. And the lady, Miss Noir, said, Miss Karen, you need a better translator.
Yes. For those of you that don't know, Google Translate is great. Do not rely on it. You'll be embarrassed. Anyway, that's what he's trying to get his disciples to understand, to focus on the work that they've been sent to do when it comes to their. Now, the other thing that we want to talk about in connection with this is, okay, if we understand that there is a division between the things of this earth and the things of heaven, and by the way, that's actually the way to construct the division. You'll recall, I mentioned earlier that time when they came to him asking him a question, and he said, first you need to answer my question. You remember what the question was he asked him? The baptism of John, was it of heaven or of men? That's the two categories. Is it something that God ordained? Did it come out of heaven, or did it arise from men on the earth? Once we understand those two categories, then we got to ask this question: which one takes precedent? The matters of God. Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. You decide what's right, but we must obey God rather than men. That's what they said. They were on trial before the authorities for preaching the gospel. And they said, hey, we told you not to teach anymore in this name. And their response was, you have to decide whether it's right or wrong for us to do this. But as for us, we must obey God rather than men. The focus has to be on the spiritual first. And so those are the important lessons to be drawing from these teachings. Is it wrong for us to pay taxes? No. Because who printed the money? In case you don't know this, every single bill that you have in your pocket, every coin that you have in your pocket is not your property. It is the property of the United States Treasury. They printed it. They put it out in circulation. If they say they want it back, what's he saying? Give it back. Render it to them. Is it fun? Is it even right or fair all the time? No. That has nothing to do with the question. The question is, it arises from them, it belongs to them. Give it back. If you let someone borrow something that you own and then you need it and you say, hey, I need that back, is it? They don't always want to give it back because they may be using it, but what should they do? Render it to you because it's yours. That's what he's saying. Now, when we talk about what we render to God, what do we have that's God's? Ourself. And if it's not apparent enough in the fact that he's the creator and that he made us, that we owe ourselves to him, then we also have that little problem that you're not your own, you've been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your bodies. As Christians, we've been bought out of our bondage to sin by the sacrifice that Jesus paid on the cross. That's a debt that God paid. So we're doubly in debt to God. There's something to think about. I need to render myself to God. And when we talk about, for instance, I think it's in 2 Corinthians, the 2 Corinthian letter, when he is encouraging the church at Corinth once again to keep the promise in sending relief to the saints in Judea, he talks about the churches of Macedonia and about the fact that they so desperately wanted to participate even though they weren't really in a position to. And that they actually begged for the right to participate in the contribution to these saints. And then it says that they first gave themselves to God. That right there, render unto God the things that are God's. They first gave themselves to God. And because they did that, then what did they do? They gave freely of their own accord to the relief of the saints in Judea. Nobody had to force them to do what was right. They wanted to do what was right because they had already given themselves to God. That's what this teaching is about. Sadducees ask about the resurrection then. It's the next section. It picks up in verse 18. The Sadducees were another group among the Jews. We've got Pharisees, we've got Sadducees, we've got various different Nicolaitans, various different groups of people who have particular doctrines that they hold on to. What was the unique thing about the Sadducees? They did not believe in the resurrection. They thought that we lived and we died and then it was over. So they come to him who say that there is no resurrection. They ask him a question saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but leaves no child, the man must take a widow and raise up offspring for his brother. That in fact was a part of the law of Moses that came through the process of things. So they're creating a scenario based on that, a hypothetical. It's a tricky one. There were 7 brothers. The first took a wife. When he died, he left no offspring. And the second took her, and he died, left no offspring. And the third likewise. And all the way to the 7, and there's no offspring. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, when they rise up again, whose wife will she be? Now, they reject the resurrection. So they reject the premise of the question to begin with themselves, but they know that he doesn't reject the resurrection. So they think they've presented him with a conundrum that is unanswerable. Who does she belong to? If there's a resurrection and they all come back, who does she belong to? And what's his answer? Well, in the resurrection, when they rise again, whose wife will she be? The 7 all had her as a wife. Jesus says, is this not the reason you're wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God? Boy, that's a pointed response. You're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. You don't understand what you're talking about, number one. And number two, you have no concept of how powerful God is. When they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor they give it in marriage, but are like the angels of heaven. What's his point? Marriage is for now, for this earthly sojourn. That's it. In the resurrection, she's nobody's wife. As for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but the living. You're quite wrong. And his point there is, and that's when Moses was speaking to God at the burning bush, and he asked him, who are you? He says, I am the God of Abraham. I am. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were long dead. But he talked to him about the present position he had as the God of these people. If when your body dies, you're gone, if that's true, then how could he be the God of Abraham if Abraham's dead? By the way, you know what this is called? Necessary inference. For those people who don't think that necessary inference is a legitimate way of drawing conclusions from the scriptures, that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. When he said, I am the God of Abraham, and Abraham was long dead, we must infer that Abraham persisted beyond the death of his body and still was. And that was the mistake they made. They didn't understand God. They didn't understand what God had made. They didn't understand the nature of anything, which is why they drew the wrong conclusions about death and life and resurrection. I have to stop, or I will shortly need to stop. So this is as good of as any place to stop. We'll pick up in verse 28 of chapter 12 next time. Anybody have any questions or comments about the things that we discussed this morning? Or anything that I didn't talk about that needs to be talked about, or anything that you want me to flesh out more fully? Yes, ma'am. Well, that's an interesting question, and it'll take a whole lot more than what I'm fixing to say, but that is an accommodative use of language to help us understand our relationship. If the husband's the head of the wife, then that lets us know that Christ is the head of the church, and that's kind of the relationship that's being talked about there. When we're all resurrected and changed and we're like him and we're all in heaven, that relationship is not going to be pertinent anymore. We're all going to be in the very presence of God. We're going to be with him. It's not going to be the same. How much is it going to change? What's it going to be like? I can't answer those questions beyond what's written. But I do know that it tells us that we will be changed, that we will go to be with him. And I can't even tell you what. Well, see, we can't even use language for this. I can't tell you what day-to-day life is going to be like in heaven. You want to know why? I can't even say that statement. You want to know why? Because time will no longer exist. Time is connected to this realm. When this realm is gone, time is gone, and there's no day-to-day life in eternity. There's just existence. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and that's trying to conceive of things, and that's great for someone to do, but I'm going to tell you, you don't need a car. No, nor do you need wings. I don't even know we're going to travel anywhere. I just don't know. I don't know what it's going to be like, but I know it's going to be good. Thanks for your participation and your questions.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful